Greetings, traveller. The frost had settled into Bramblewick Gearwhistle's bones again, and this time he feared it might never leave. He sat hunched over his workbench in the dim light of his mountain workshop, breath misting in small clouds as he bent over a half-assembled clockwork mechanism. The metal components were so cold they burned his fingertips, even through his worn leather gloves. Outside, the wind howled through the peaks of the Frostwhir Mountains with the same relentless voice it had carried for the past 7 months of winter. Bramblewick set down his tools and flexed his aching fingers. At 3 feet tall, even by gnomish standards, he was considered slight, but years of metalwork had given his hands a wiry strength. Now, however, they trembled not from exertion, but from the bone-deep chill that no amount of layered wool could banish. The small brazier in the corner of his workshop glowed with precious coal, but its warmth seemed to evaporate before reaching him, swallowed by the hungry cold of the mountain air. He stood and walked to the single window, its glass thick with frost patterns that never fully melted, not even during the brief summer months. Through the crystalline maze, he could make out the familiar vista of his homeland. Endless peaks draped in snow, their sharp edges softened by the perpetual grey clouds that blanketed the Frostwhir range. It was beautiful, he supposed, in its austere way. His people had called these mountains home for countless generations, carving their settlements into the living rock, building their forges deep in the mountain's heart, where the earth's warmth could sustain them through the endless winters. But beauty, Bramblewick had come to realize, was cold comfort when your very soul felt frozen. He pressed his forehead against the window, the cold glass shocking against his skin, and closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he conjured the same vision that had been visiting him more and more frequently in recent months. Rolling green hills under a sky the color of summer meadows, warm air that carried the scent of flowers rather than ice and stone, and above it all, a sun that shone with gentle constancy rather than the pale, distant orb that struggled to pierce the mountain clouds. Sunreach Vale. Even the name filled him with longing. It was said to lie far to the south, beyond the treacherous iron-bound marches, in a land where winter was but a brief mild visitor, and where the seasons turned with predictable grace. Bramblewick had never met anyone who had actually been there, but the stories persisted in the taverns and workshops of his people. Tales brought by travelling merchants and wandering scholars who spoke of a place where metal stayed warm to the touch and where inventors could work by natural light for most of the day. A sharp gust of wind rattled the window, pulling Bramblewick back to the present. He opened his eyes and gazed once more at the snow-locked peaks surrounding him. Somewhere down in the valley, his cousin Thornwick would be tending the communal forges, his face ruddy with heat and contentment as he shaped iron into tools and trinkets. Thornwick thrived in the mountain cold, claimed it sharpened his focus and strengthened his resolve. Most of their kin felt the same way. They wore their endurance of the harsh climate like a badge of honor, proof of their gnomish resilience. Bramblewick had once felt that pride too. In his younger days, he had relished the challenge of working with metals so cold they could shatter if mishandled, had taken satisfaction in coaxing his delicate mechanisms to function, despite the mountain's attempts to freeze their moving parts. He had been known throughout the Frostwear settlements as a gifted inventor, capable of creating devices of remarkable intricacy and function. His workshop was filled with the fruits of those productive years, self-winding chronometers that could keep time despite temperature fluctuations, heating elements powered by ingenious gear systems, and delicate instruments that could measure air pressure and predict the mountain's mercurial weather patterns. But somewhere along the way, the satisfaction had leaked out of him like warmth from a poorly insulated room. The endless cycle of survival had worn him down, the constant battle against cold, the months of grey skies, the way life seemed to contract during the long winters until it consisted of nothing more than endurance. His inventions, once sources of joy and pride, had become mere necessities for surviving another season in the mountain's grip. Bramblewick turned away from the window and surveyed his workshop. Tools hung from every available surface, their metal surfaces dull in the lamplight. Gears and springs filled dozens of small drawers, organized with the precision that came from decades of careful work. Books and scrolls detailing mechanical principles and engineering solutions covered a desk in the far corner. It was the workspace of a master craftsman, accumulated over a lifetime of dedication to his craft. Yet, as he looked at it all, Bramblewick felt only weariness. The tools seemed to reproach him with their cold silence, the unfinished projects stacked on his shelves a testament to his growing inability to find purpose in his work. He had spent the last month attempting to design an improved heating system for the settlement's communal spaces, but each time he sat down to work on the calculations, his mind wandered south, chasing dreams of warmth and sunlight. He moved to a chest in the corner of the workshop and lifted its heavy lid. Inside, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, lay a collection of maps and journals he had acquired over the years from traders and travelers. With reverent hands, he lifted out a particular scroll, a map drawn by a merchant who claimed to have traveled the southern routes in his youth. The parchment was yellowed with age, its edges soft from handling, but the ink remained clear. Bramblewick spread the map across his workbench, weighing down its corners with small tools. His finger traced the route from his mountain home southward, following the careful notations the merchant had made. The path led down from the Frostwear peaks, across the foothills, and then there. The iron-bound marches, a region marked on the map with symbols that needed no interpretation, crossed swords, skull markers, and notations in the merchant's spidery handwriting. Hostile to gnomes, travel not advised, bandit clans, death likely. Beyond the marches, the map showed a different landscape entirely. Rivers marked in blue, forests indicated by clusters of tiny trees, and in the far south, a valley ringed by gentle hills. Sunreach Vale, read the notation, with smaller text below. Warm year-round. Good. Soil. Peaceful. Sun shines most days. Bramblewick had stared at this map countless times, but tonight something was different. Instead of simply dreaming, he found himself studying the problem with the analytical mind that had made him a skilled inventor. The iron-bound marches presented a clear obstacle. The various clans and bandit groups that controlled the region had harbored animosity toward gnomes for generations. viewing them as useful for their mechanical skills, but ultimately expendable. A lone gnome traveling overland through their territory would likely not survive the journey. But what if one didn't need to travel overland? The thought struck him with such sudden clarity that he straightened up, nearly knocking over his lamp. His eyes moved to a shelf where several mechanical birds of his own design perched motionless, devices he had created years ago to study the principles of flight. They were intricate works of clockwork artistry, capable of gliding and flapping with remarkable realism, though none had ever achieved true sustained flight. The concept had fascinated him since childhood, when he had watched the great eagles soar over the mountain peaks, seemingly immune to the barriers that constrained earthbound creatures. He had experimented with various flying machines over the years, though none had progressed beyond small-scale models. The principles were sound, he knew, but the practical challenges had always seemed insurmountable. Now, however, those challenges looked different, not insurmountable, but simply complex. And complexity had never frightened Bramblewick Gearwhistle. He pulled out a sheet of fresh parchment and began sketching, his hand moving with more confidence than it had shown in months. The design that flowed from his pen was ambitious. A flying machine large enough to carry a gnome and his essential belongings, powered by steam and controlled by an intricate system of gears and levers. Not a mere glider or ornithopter, but something more akin to the mechanical dragonflies he had built as a young inventor, scaled up and engineered for long-distance travel. The more he drew, the more excited he became. Steam power would provide the necessary lift. He had worked with steam mechanisms for decades and understood their capabilities intimately. A rotor system, similar to the maple seeds that spiraled down from the mountain trees, could provide both lift and directional control. The body of the machine would need to be light but strong, capable of withstanding both the thin air of high altitude and the stress of extended flight. As the night deepened around him, Bramblewick found himself lost in the familiar rhythm of invention. His mind raced ahead of his pen, visualizing components and calculating stresses, identifying potential problems and engineering solutions. For the first time in months, the cold seemed distant, pushed back by the warmth of creative passion. The basic design was sound, but as he refined the details, Bramblewick began to realize the magnitude of what he was contemplating. Such a machine would require components he didn't currently possess, specialized parts that would need to be obtained from various sources throughout the region. The rotors alone would require materials and craftsmanship beyond what his workshop could provide. He set down his pen and rubbed his tired eyes. Dawn was beginning to creep through the frost-covered window, painting the workshop in pale grey light. The ambitious sketches spread across his workbench looked both thrilling and daunting in the morning light. What he was considering was unprecedented. No gnome had ever attempted to build a flying machine of such complexity and scale. But as he looked once more at the map, with its promise of warmth and sunlight beyond the hostile marches, Bramblewick felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine hope. The path would be difficult and dangerous, requiring him to venture far from his mountain home and acquire components from sources both familiar and unknown. Yet, for the first time in his life, he had a real plan for escape from the endless winter that had settled into his soul. He began making lists, his practical mind taking over from his creative inspiration. First, he would need basic components, gears, springs, metal stock, and tools that his workshop lacked. The old airfield at Cogspire would be the logical place to start. It had been abandoned for decades, but rumors persisted of valuable mechanical components left behind in its hangars. Next, he would need the rotors themselves. This presented a more complex challenge, as the spinning blades would need to be perfectly balanced and crafted from materials that could withstand tremendous stress. He remembered the experimental rotors he had created years ago for a failed flying machine. They had been stolen by a band of yetis during one of their raids on the settlement's outskirts. If those rotors still existed, and if they were still functional, they might serve his purpose. Finally, and most critically, he would need the core components of the machine, the steam engine, the control mechanisms, and the structural elements that would hold everything together under the stress of flight. Such work required the skills of master craftsmen, and Bramblewick knew of only one place in the region where such artisans could be found: the great forges of Stonehelm, the dwarven capital. Each stop on his journey would present its own challenges and dangers. Cogspire was abandoned for good reason. The high mountain passes that led to it were treacherous even in good weather. The yetis who had taken his rotors were not known for their cooperative nature, and approaching them would require careful planning and no small amount of courage. As for Stonehelm, while the dwarves were not hostile to gnomes, they were notoriously selective about the projects they chose to support. Yet, as challenging as these obstacles appeared, they seemed manageable compared to the alternative. Remaining in his workshop, slowly succumbing to the spiritual winter that threatened to extinguish his creative spark entirely. At least, this path offered hope, however distant, of reaching the warmth and light he craved. Bramblewick rolled up his maps and sketches, securing them with leather ties. He moved through his workshop, selecting tools and supplies he would need for the journey ahead. His hands moved with purpose for the first time in months, driven by the clarity of decision. He would build his flying machine component by component, challenge by challenge, and when it was complete, he would leave the Frostwear peaks behind forever, soaring over the hostile marches toward the promised warmth of Sunreach Vale. The frost was still there in his bones, but now it felt temporary, not a permanent settlement, but merely winter's last stand before the coming spring of his own making. The journey to Cogspire Airfield began before dawn 3 days later. Bramblewick had spent the intervening time preparing his pack with meticulous care, selecting only the most essential tools and supplies. His sled, a sturdy construction of his own design, carried additional equipment wrapped in waterproof canvas. The runners glided smoothly over the packed snow as he made his way up the winding mountain path, following routes he hadn't traveled in years. The airfield lay high above his settlement, built in the days when gnomish aviators had dreamed of conquering the skies above the Frostwear peaks. Those dreams had ended badly. Too many machines lost to sudden storms, too many pilots claimed by the treacherous mountain winds. The facility had been formally abandoned during Bramblewick's youth, its hangars sealed and its runways left to the mercy of wind and weather. As he climbed, the familiar ache in his joints reminded him why so few gnomes ventured to these heights anymore. The air grew thinner with each step, and the cold seemed to bite deeper despite his carefully layered clothing. Yet Bramblewick found himself energized by the physical challenge in a way that surprised him. For months he had felt sluggish and worn down, but now, with a clear purpose driving him forward, his body seemed to remember its resilience. The path wound between massive stone outcroppings, their surfaces sculpted by centuries of wind into fantastic shapes that resembled frozen waterfalls and abstract sculptures. Occasionally he passed the remains of old waymarkers, carved stones that had once guided travelers to the airfield. Most were now buried under years of accumulated snow and ice, visible only as subtle mounds beside the trail. By midday, Bramblewick reached the final approach to Cogspire. The airfield spread before him like a ghost town of aviation dreams. A collection of low, weathered buildings clustered around what had once been carefully maintained runways. Snow had drifted against the hangar doors in smooth curves, and icicles hung like crystal teeth from every eave and overhang. The wind here carried a different quality than in the lower valleys, whistling through gaps and openings with a lonely sound that seemed to speak of abandonment and forgotten ambitions. Bramblewick approached the largest hangar with cautious optimism. The massive doors, designed to accommodate the bulky flying machines of an earlier era, stood slightly ajar, whether by design or the gradual settling of the building's foundation, he couldn't tell. The gap was just wide enough for him to slip through sideways, dragging his sled behind him. Inside, the hangar was a cavern of shadows and dust-covered shapes. Shafts of pale light filtered through gaps in the roof, illuminating a scene that filled Bramblewick with both excitement and melancholy. The skeletal remains of several flying machines occupied the floor space. Ambitious contraptions of wood, metal, and canvas that had once represented the pinnacle of gnomish engineering. Most were incomplete, their designers apparently having abandoned them when the airfield was evacuated. But it was not the failed aircraft that drew Bramblewick's attention. It was the workshops along the hangar's walls, where tools and components lay scattered on dust-covered benches like artifacts from a more optimistic time. He set down his pack and began exploring with the reverent care of an archaeologist. The first workbench yielded a collection of precision gears, their teeth still sharp despite decades of neglect. Bramblewick cleaned each one carefully, testing their action and noting their specifications in a small journal. These were superior to anything he could fabricate in his mountain workshop, crafted by specialists who had understood the unique demands of aviation engineering. At a second bench, he discovered a set of specialized tools designed for working with the lightweight alloys favored by the old aviators. The metal had a different character than the iron and steel he was accustomed to, stronger for its weight, with a subtle flexibility that would be crucial for his flying machine's construction. Several sheets of the alloy lay stacked beneath a canvas tarp, their surfaces unmarked by corrosion despite the hangar's moisture and temperature fluctuations. As he worked his way systematically through the abandoned workspace, Bramblewick began to feel a connection to the gnomes who had labored here decades before. Their dreams had been similar to his own, to escape the constraints of earthbound existence and find freedom in the skies above. That their efforts had ultimately failed did not diminish the ingenuity and craftsmanship evident in their work. In a storage alcove near the back of the hangar, he made his most valuable discovery, a complete steam engine, small but beautifully crafted, designed specifically for aviation use. The unit was more compact than anything he could have built himself, yet the brass nameplate indicated it was capable of producing substantial power. Best of all, it appeared to be in excellent condition, protected from the elements by a heavy oiled cover. Bramblewick spent the remainder of the day carefully packaging his finds, wrapping each component in cloth before securing them in his sled. The weight was substantial, but the sled's design would allow him to manage the load during his descent. As evening approached, he made camp in a corner of the hangar, using a small camp stove to prepare a simple meal while surrounded by the ghosts of failed dreams. That night, as wind howled through the gaps in the hangar walls, Bramblewick studied his sketches by lamplight, refining his design to incorporate the components he had acquired. The steam engine would serve as the heart of his flying machine, its compact efficiency perfect for his needs. The precision gears would allow him to create the complex transmission system necessary to convert the engine's power into rotor motion. The lightweight alloy would form the machine's frame, providing strength without excessive weight. He slept fitfully on his bedroll, his dreams filled with images of spinning rotors and open skies. When dawn came, pale and cold through the hangar's broken windows, he felt more optimistic than he had in years. The first phase of his quest was complete, and while challenges remained, they no longer seemed insurmountable. The descent from Cogspire proved easier than the climb, the loaded sled's momentum helping to carry him down the winding trail. By late afternoon, he was back in his workshop, unpacking his treasures and arranging them on his workbenches. The components looked even more promising in the familiar surroundings of his home, their quality and craftsmanship evident even in the workshop's dim light. But Bramblewick allowed himself only one day to rest and organize before beginning preparations for the next phase of his journey. The rotors remained the most critical missing component, and recovering them would require a very different kind of courage than exploring abandoned hangars. The yetis of the Shiver-Deep caverns were not inherently malicious, but they were territorial, unpredictable, and possessed of a strength that made direct confrontation inadvisable for any gnome. Bramblewick had encountered them before during their occasional raids on the settlement's outskirts, and he knew them to be intelligent despite their fearsome appearance. They collected mechanical devices with the enthusiasm of children gathering interesting stones, often taking items not for any practical purpose, but simply because the moving parts and gleaming metal appealed to their magpie-like sensibilities. His experimental rotors, stolen during a raid several years earlier, had likely been added to whatever collection the Yeti clan maintained in their deep caves. The challenge would be locating the specific items among whatever hoard they had accumulated, and then convincing the creatures to part with them. For this journey, Bramblewick's preparations took a different form. Instead of tools and materials, he packed items he hoped would appeal to yeti sensibilities, small mechanical toys of his own creation, devices with moving parts and bright metal surfaces. He also brought materials for making repairs, reasoning that if the yetis had been handling his rotors for several years, the delicate mechanisms might need attention. The entrance to Shiver-Deep Caverns lay a day's journey north of his settlement, accessible through a network of trails that wound between towering ice formations. The caverns had been carved by an underground river that had since changed course, leaving behind a labyrinth of chambers and passages that extended deep into the mountain's heart. The yetis had claimed this territory generations ago, making their homes in the deeper chambers where the earth's warmth provided relief from the surface cold. Bramblewick approached the cavern entrance in mid-morning, when the pale sun provided maximum light for the journey underground. The opening yawned before him like a massive mouth, its edges fringed with icicles that clicked and chimed in the mountain breeze. He paused at the threshold, adjusting his pack and checking his lamp one final time before stepping into the blue-shadowed world beyond. The first chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in darkness above. Strange acoustic properties made every footstep echo in complex patterns, creating the impression of invisible companions walking alongside him. The floor was uneven but navigable, covered with a thin layer of ice that crunched softly beneath his boots. His lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls, revealing stone surfaces carved by water into flowing, organic shapes. Deeper into the cavern system, Bramblewick began to encounter signs of yeti habitation. Scratches in the stone where massive claws had found purchase, scattered bones from meals, and the distinctive musky scent that marked their territory. He moved carefully, making enough noise to announce his presence without appearing either stealthy or aggressive. Surprising a yeti in its own domain would be inadvisable at best. The sound reached him before the sight, a rhythmic clicking and whirring that spoke of mechanical devices in operation. Following the sound through a narrow passage, Bramblewick emerged into a chamber that took his breath away. The yetis had created a vast collection of mechanical objects, arranged throughout the space with no apparent organization but obvious care. Clockwork mechanisms ticked and whirred on stone shelves. Metal sculptures caught and reflected his lamplight. And in the center of it all, a massive yeti sat cross-legged, delicately manipulating a complex puzzle box with fingers that seemed too large for such precise work. The creature looked up at Bramblewick's approach, its intelligent brown eyes showing curiosity rather than hostility. It spoke in the deep, resonant language of its kind, a sound like distant thunder combined with the grinding of glacial ice. While Bramblewick could not understand the specific words, the tone seemed questioning rather than threatening. He set down his pack slowly and withdrew one of the mechanical toys he had brought, a small clockwork bird that flapped its wings and opened its beak in a remarkably lifelike manner. The yeti's eyes widened with immediate interest, and it extended one massive hand in a gesture that was clearly a request to examine the device. What followed was a careful negotiation conducted entirely through gestures, mechanical demonstrations, and the gradual building of trust. Bramblewick showed the yeti how his toys worked, allowing the creature to examine their mechanisms and even make simple adjustments. In return, the yeti led him through its collection, proudly displaying various mechanical treasures and demonstrating their functions. It was near the back of the chamber that Bramblewick spotted his missing rotors, mounted on a stone pedestal like pieces of art. The yeti had clearly been fascinated by their construction, and while the devices showed signs of handling, they appeared to be in remarkably good condition. The careful way they were displayed suggested they held a place of honor in the collection. Bramblewick approached the rotors slowly, pointing to himself and then to the devices while making questioning sounds. The yeti's expression grew thoughtful, then somewhat reluctant. A lengthy pantomimed conversation followed, with the creature clearly torn between its desire for the new toys Bramblewick offered and its attachment to the rotors it had possessed for years. The breakthrough came when Bramblewick demonstrated how his mechanical bird could be wound and adjusted to perform different flight patterns. The yeti was enchanted by the device's versatility, and when Bramblewick indicated he would trade not only the bird but several other toys for his rotors, the creature's excitement overcame its reluctance. The exchange was completed with ceremonial gravity. Each item passed between them with mutual respect and evident satisfaction. The yeti carefully packed Bramblewick's rotors in soft hide wrappings, while Bramblewick spent considerable time showing the creature how to maintain and adjust its new acquisitions. By the time he prepared to leave, both parties seemed genuinely pleased with the transaction. The journey back to the surface felt triumphant, despite the weight of the recovered rotors in his pack. Bramblewick had not only retrieved essential components for his flying machine, but had done so through ingenuity and peaceful negotiation rather than conflict. The success filled him with confidence for the most challenging phase of his quest, the journey to Stonehelm and the dwarven forges. Back in his workshop that evening, Bramblewick carefully examined the rotors under proper lighting. The yetis had indeed handled them extensively, but their innate understanding of mechanical objects had led them to treat the devices with appropriate care. A few joints needed lubrication and minor adjustments, but the rotors were fundamentally sound and ready for installation once he obtained the remaining components. With 2/3 of his required materials now secured, Bramblewick turned his attention to planning the journey south to Stonehelm. This would be by far the longest and most complex leg of his quest, requiring him to travel through terrain he had never seen and negotiate with craftsmen renowned for their exacting standards. The dwarves were skilled beyond question, but they were also notoriously particular about the projects they chose to support. Yet, as he studied his maps by lamplight, marking the route through mountain passes and valley floors, Bramblewick felt a deep satisfaction settling into his bones. Each completed phase of his quest brought him closer, not only to his flying machine, but to the warm southern lands that had become the focus of all his hopes. The frost in his soul was beginning to thaw, melted by the heat of purpose and the growing certainty that his dream of escape was not merely possible, but inevitable. The fire in his workshop's brazier burned brighter that night, or perhaps it only seemed so to a gnome whose inner winter was finally coming to an end. The road to Stonehelm stretched before Bramblewick like a ribbon of possibility, winding through landscapes that grew gentler and less familiar with each passing mile. He had left the Frostweir Peaks 5 days earlier, his pack heavier now with the components from Cogspire and the precious rotors reclaimed from the yetis. The farther south he travelled, the more the harsh mountain climate gave way to something that felt almost welcoming. Snow that melted during the day, air that didn't burn his lungs with each breath, and, most remarkably, glimpses of actual sunlight breaking through the perpetual cloud cover. The change was subtle but profound, like watching winter slowly lose its grip on the world. Bramblewick found himself pausing frequently during his journey, not from fatigue, but from wonder at landscapes he had only imagined. Trees that bore green needles instead of being stripped bare by wind and ice. Streams that flowed freely rather than being locked under thick layers of frost. And everywhere the sense of a world that lived rather than merely endured. As he crested the final ridge before Stonehelm, Bramblewick stopped entirely, setting down his pack to stare at the sight below. The great dwarven city sprawled across the valley floor like a masterwork of engineering made manifest. Smoke rose from countless chimneys and forge towers, creating a haze that caught and held the afternoon light in shades of gold and amber. Even from this distance, he could hear the rhythmic hammering of metal on metal, a sound that spoke of productivity and purpose on a scale that dwarfed his mountain settlement. The descent into the valley took the remainder of the day, and by the time Bramblewick reached Stonehelm's outer gates, evening was painting the sky in colours he rarely saw through the mountain clouds. Deep purples and soft roses that made the city's stone architecture glow with warmth. The guards at the gate were courteous, if somewhat puzzled by the sight of a lone gnome seeking entry, but his credentials as a craftsman and inventor opened the way without difficulty. Inside the city walls, Bramblewick found himself immersed in a world of controlled chaos. The streets buzzed with activity even as night fell, with apprentices hurrying between workshops, merchants hauling carts loaded with raw materials, and the constant background symphony of working forges. The air itself seemed alive with purpose, thick with the scents of hot metal, coal smoke, and the particular mixture of oil and sweat that marked a community dedicated to creation. He secured lodging at an inn that catered to visiting craftsmen, an establishment that hummed with conversation in a dozen different dialects and languages. Over a meal that was both heartier and more flavorful than anything available in his mountain home, Bramblewick listened to the conversations around him, gradually learning the rhythms and customs of dwarven commerce. Projects were discussed, materials evaluated, and reputations assessed with the casual expertise of masters who had devoted their lives to their crafts. The next morning, armed with directions from his innkeeper, Bramblewick made his way to the forge district where the city's master smiths maintained their workshops. He had decided to approach Ironheart Forge Works, an establishment renowned for precision work and innovative techniques. If anyone could craft the specialized components his flying machine required, it would be the artisans who worked there. The workshop's exterior was impressive but not ostentatious. solid stone construction with reinforced doors and windows designed to contain the heat and noise of serious metalworking. Inside, the space opened into a cathedral of creation, with high ceilings crossed by massive beams and work areas arranged around a central forge that glowed like a captured star. The heat hit Bramblewick immediately, a wave of warmth so complete and enveloping that he nearly gasped with pleasure. After months of fighting the mountain cold, the forge's atmosphere felt like a physical embrace. Master Ironheart herself was a dwarf of middle years, with silver-streaked hair bound back in practical braids and arms, marked by the small scars that spoke of decades working hot metal. She looked up from a delicate piece of toolwork as Bramblewick approached, her expression one of polite curiosity, tinged with the wariness that skilled craftsmen reserved for unfamiliar clients. "What brings a mountain gnome to my forge?" she asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being respected in her domain. Bramblewick had rehearsed this moment during his journey, but now faced with the reality of explaining his ambitious project, he found himself speaking from the heart rather than from preparation. He told her about the endless winters of the Frostwear peaks, about the cold that had settled into his bones and soul, about his dream of reaching Sunreach Vale, and the flying machine he hoped would carry him there. As he spoke, he spread his sketches on a nearby workbench, showing the intricate design he had refined during his travels. Master Ironheart examined the drawings with the focused attention of a professional, her experienced eye tracking the mechanical relationships and structural requirements. Her apprentices gathered around, drawn by curiosity and the novelty of a project unlike anything they had encountered. "This is ambitious work," Master Ironheart said finally, her tone neutral but not dismissive. "The stress calculations alone—" She paused, studying a particular detail. "You understand that such a machine has never been successfully built, that the materials and precision required are at the very limits of what current techniques can achieve." "I understand," Bramblewick replied quietly. "But I also understand that remaining where I am means accepting a kind of death, not of body, but of spirit. I've gathered the other components I need." He indicated his pack, where the rotors and mechanisms from his earlier journeys waited. "What I require now are the core structural elements and control systems, work that demands the skill of true masters." Master Ironheart studied him for a long moment, her weathered face thoughtful. Around them, the forge continued its rhythmic work, but Bramblewick sensed that the other craftsmen were listening, weighing his words and his project with the careful consideration his dreams deserved. "Show me what you've brought," she said at last. The next hour passed in detailed examination as Bramblewick unpacked and displayed each component he had acquired. Master Ironheart and her apprentices inspected the steam engine from Cogspire with evident appreciation, noting the quality of its construction and the cleverness of its design. The rotors drew particular attention, their complex balance and precision craftsmanship earning nods of professional approval. "These are good work," Master Ironheart acknowledged. "Whoever built them understood the principles involved." "And you say you designed the original versions yourself?" "Years ago," Bramblewick confirmed. "They were part of an early experiment that never reached completion. Finding them again, It felt like recovering a piece of my younger self. Something in his tone seemed to resonate with the dwarven master. She returned to his sketches, this time studying them not as a potential client's fantasy, but as a serious engineering challenge worthy of her attention. Her questions grew more technical, probing the mechanical details and stress calculations with the thoroughness of someone genuinely considering the project's feasibility. The control system will be the greatest challenge, she mused, tracing the lines of his design with one calloused finger. The pilot must be able to adjust rotor angle, engine power, and directional thrust simultaneously, all while maintaining stable flight. A single mistake would likely be fatal, Bramblewick agreed, but no more fatal than remaining trapped in a life that grows colder and smaller with each passing year. Master Ironheart looked at him sharply, and for a moment her professional demeanor cracked to reveal something more personal. "Aye," she said softly, "I know something of that feeling myself. There was a time." She shook her head, returning to the present. "But that's neither here nor there. What matters is whether this dream of yours can be made real." The negotiation that followed was unlike anything Bramblewick had experienced. Rather than simply discussing price and delivery, Master Ironheart involved him in the design process itself, suggesting modifications that would strengthen weak points and improve the machine's functionality. Her apprentices contributed ideas with the enthusiasm of craftsmen presented with a genuinely novel challenge, and gradually the project evolved from Bramblewick's solitary dream into a collaborative effort. The work would take a full week, Master Ironheart explained, as each component would need to be crafted individually and then tested to ensure it met the demanding specifications. The cost would be substantial, representing most of Bramblewick's accumulated savings, but the dwarven master seemed more interested in the technical challenge than the financial reward. "It's been too long since we worked on something truly innovative," she admitted as her apprentices began gathering materials. "Most of our commissions are variations on familiar themes: swords, tools, decorative pieces. Your flying machine, it pushes us to remember why we became smiths in the first place." The week that followed was the most remarkable of Bramblewick's life. Each day he returned to the forge to observe the progress, watching as Master Ironheart and her team transformed raw metal into components of impossible intricacy and precision. The control mechanisms took shape like mechanical poetry, each lever and gear perfectly balanced and calibrated. The structural frame emerged as a work of art as much as engineering, its curves and joints flowing together in harmonious strength. But it was not merely the craftsmanship that amazed him. It was the collaboration itself. The dwarven smiths treated him not as a customer, but as a fellow creator, seeking his input on design decisions and incorporating his suggestions into their work. For the first time in years, Bramblewick felt truly part of a community of makers, united by shared purpose and mutual respect. On the final day, as Master Ironheart made the last adjustments to the control assembly, she looked up at Bramblewick with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with something deeper. "This may be the finest work we've ever done," she said quietly. "Whether it flies or not, It represents the best of what we can achieve when we push beyond the merely practical into the realm of dreams made manifest. The journey home took on a ceremonial quality, each mile bringing Bramblewick closer to the moment when his months of planning and preparation would be tested against reality. The components from Stonehelm fit perfectly in his pack alongside the earlier acquisitions, their combined weight a tangible reminder of all he had accomplished. As he climbed back into the familiar territory of the Frostweir Peaks, however, he was struck by how different the landscape seemed. Not changed in itself, but somehow diminished, as if his travels had revealed the wider world's possibilities and made the mountain's harsh beauty feel limiting rather than homelike. His workshop, when he finally reached it, felt both welcoming and strange. The tools and familiar surroundings remained as he had left them, but his perspective had been altered by his journey. Where once he had seen the accumulated work of a lifetime, he now saw the launching point for a new existence, the place where his most ambitious dream would finally take physical form. The assembly process began immediately and proceeded with a smoothness that surprised even Bramblewick. The components fit together with the precision of a master clockmaker's work, each part sliding into place with satisfying certainty. The steam engine mounted perfectly in its housing, the rotors balanced and aligned with mathematical precision, the control systems responding to his touch with delicate accuracy. As he worked, Bramblewick found himself thinking not of the technical challenges, but of the human connections that had made this moment possible. The unknown aviators of Cogspire, whose abandoned dreams had provided essential components. The yeti, whose childlike fascination with mechanical devices had led to the careful preservation of his rotors. Master Ironheart and her apprentices, who had embraced his vision and transformed it into reality through their skill and dedication. The final assembly took 3 days of careful, methodical work. When Bramblewick stepped back to examine the completed machine, he felt a moment of pure disbelief. It sat in his workshop like a mechanical dragon, its rotors gleaming in the lamplight, its steam engine radiating quiet power, its frame combining strength and grace in equal measure. Every line and curve spoke of purposeful design, every component precisely positioned for optimal function. But the true test would come not in the workshop, but in the open air, under conditions that would reveal whether months of planning and preparation had produced a flying machine or merely an elaborate sculpture. The morning of the test flight dawned clear and still, with visibility that extended far beyond the usual mountain haze. Bramblewick had chosen a launch site on a broad plateau near his settlement, an area with enough open space to accommodate both takeoff and emergency landing if the worst occurred. The flying machine, transported on a specially constructed cart, looked even more impressive in natural light, its metalwork catching and reflecting the pale mountain sun. As he made final preparations, checking fuel levels and testing control responses, Bramblewick was surprised by the arrival of several neighbours who had heard rumours of his project. Thornwick was there, his cousin's face mixing skepticism with unmistakable pride. Others from the settlement gathered at a respectful distance, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern to something that might have been envy. "Are you certain about this?" Thornwick asked quietly, his engineer's eye taking in the machine's complexity. "It's magnificent work, but the risk of staying is greater than the risk of flying," Bramblewick replied, and as he spoke, the words he realized they contained a truth deeper than mere adventure-seeking. This was not simply about reaching Sunreach Vale. It was about refusing to accept the gradual dimming of spirit that came with endless endurance of conditions that crushed rather than nurtured the soul. He climbed into the pilot's seat, a carefully padded platform surrounded by the controls that would determine his fate. The steam engine responded immediately to his commands, building pressure with efficient grace. The rotors began their slow rotation, gradually increasing speed until they blurred into invisible circles of motion. The machine trembled slightly, as if eager to fulfill its purpose. The moment of liftoff came not with drama, but with a gentle rising sensation, as if the earth was slowly falling away beneath him. Bramblewick felt his stomach drop with surprise and delight as the plateau shrank below, the watching faces of his neighbors becoming distant specks in an increasingly expansive landscape. The machine's controls responded precisely to his inputs, allowing him to adjust altitude and direction with growing confidence. For the first time in his adult life, Bramblewick was truly warm, not the artificial warmth of braziers and heavy clothing, but the deep warmth that came from fulfillment and joy. Below him, the frostwear peaks spread out in their harsh magnificence, beautiful but no longer confining. Ahead, visible in the clear air, lay the southern lands he had dreamed of for so many months. He circled the plateau once in farewell, dipping the machine's rotors in salute to the community that had shaped him and the workshop where his dreams had taken form. Then he turned south, toward the distant promise of Sunreach Vale, toward a land where the sun shone gently and the air carried warmth instead of bitter cold. The iron-bound marches passed far below, their hostile territory rendered harmless by altitude. Bramblewick could see the scattered settlements and fortified positions that made overland travel so dangerous, but from his aerial perspective they seemed small and insignificant, unable to threaten anyone with the freedom of flight. As the hours passed and the landscape gradually transformed from the familiar harshness of the north to the gentler contours of the southern regions, Bramblewick felt a profound sense of completion settling into his bones. Not the completion of ending, but of beginning. The fulfillment that came from refusing to accept limitations and instead choosing to pursue possibilities. The sun was setting by the time Sunreach Vale came into view, its rolling hills and green meadows bathed in golden light that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The air was warm and soft, carrying scents of growing things and the promise of seasons that turned with gentleness rather than harsh extremes. As his flying machine descended toward a meadow that seemed designed by nature as a perfect landing field, Bramblewick felt the last of the winter frost melting from his soul. He set the machine down with barely a bump, its rotor wash stirring the grass in wide circles around the landing site. As the engine wound down and the rotors slowed to visibility, the silence that settled over the meadow was not the harsh quiet of mountain cold, but the peaceful stillness of a summer evening in a land where warmth was the natural order of things. Bramblewick climbed down from the pilot's seat and stood for a moment in the soft grass, feeling the gentle air on his face and the solid earth beneath his feet. In the distance, smoke rose from chimneys that spoke not of desperate battles against cold, but of comfortable homes where fires were kindled for pleasure rather than survival. The sky above was clear and deep, painted in colors that shifted from blue to violet to the first faint appearance of stars. He had done it. Against all probability, despite every reasonable expectation of failure, he had built a flying machine that worked, escaped the confines of his mountain home, and reached the warm lands that had called to him through so many cold nights. The frost that had settled into his bones was gone, replaced by the deep warmth of a dream fulfilled and a new life begun. In the years that followed, stories would occasionally reach the frost-whir peaks of a gnome inventor who had appeared in the southern lands aboard a miraculous flying machine, who had settled in Sunreach Vale and established a workshop where the principles of flight were studied and refined. But to his former neighbours, Bramblewick Gearwhistle remained a mystery. The craftsman who had disappeared into the sky one clear morning and never returned, not because he was lost, but because he had finally found the warmth his spirit required to truly live. And in his new workshop, surrounded by the gentle climate of Sunreach Vale, Bramblewick continued to invent and create, his hands now working in sunlight that streamed through windows that never frosted, his soul warmed by the knowledge that sometimes the most impossible dreams were simply the most necessary ones, waiting for the courage to make them real.